Last year, I went out on my own into the forest about an hour from my house to go camping for a night. I wasn't planning anything special, I just wanted to spend some time outside for a day and then go home. And although inexperienced, I didn't see the harm in being out for just a day. When I got to the camping trail, there were 3 cars parked on the road right next to it. I really didn't want to talk to anyone or spend the day around other people, so I kept driving until I found a different trail down the road. There were no places to park, so I had to go further down and then walk back. This trail was very thin and was all dirt, no gravel or anything, so it definitely wasn't a popular spot. I started down it, going through relatively flat terrain with nothing but trees and bushes around. As I got about 2 hours in, the trail slowly started thinning out until it was getting difficult to even tell if I was still on it or not. I had a feeling this could happen at the beginning, but I was 2 hours in, so I wasn't even worried about it by then and had completely overlooked it. I turned around and started to make my way back, trying my best to find the more defined portion of the path, but just 5 minutes later, I saw something that made me stop in my place. A cabin sitting right in the middle of the forest. My first thought on seeing it was that I was 100% lost because I hadn't seen it on the way up, but then my thoughts shifted toward the eerie feeling it was giving me. What was a cabin doing way out here? I approached it slowly, and seeing as it had no door, I looked inside. It was a mess, full of old garbage. The longer I stayed though, the more creeped out I got. I turned around and started going back to the trail, but was interrupted by a loud thump from behind me. I looked back at the cabin, and through the doorway, I saw a man appear from behind the wall. He was middle-aged and wearing torn-up clothes, pretty much looking like he lived there. He looked at me with a creepy, emotionless face. I nervously said sorry, then quickly walked away. I looked back once, seeing him staring at me as I got further away. I spent the next hour on edge, looking everywhere for the trail while also making sure I wasn't being followed. As the sun began to set, I got increasingly more worried, but thankfully, just before the light was gone, I found the middle of the trail. I debated just going back to my car, but chose to stake out the night just to be sure I didn't lose my way again. I unloaded my bag and got my tent set up, then went inside and laid down. I had planned to get a fire going and do a bunch of other stuff, but at this point I wasn't even in the mood anymore and just wanted to rest. I closed my eyes and drifted into sleep. When my eyes opened, it was pitch black and all I heard was the forest creaking. I tilted my head and my eyes locked on the entrance to my tent. Staring back at me was the shadow-covered face of the man, with his head sticking through the half-opened entryway. I jumped back and the man did the same. I heard his footsteps hurrying away as I got out and looked, only seeing the back of him running into the woods. With my heart still racing, I undid everything and shoved it into my bag, then carefully followed the trail all the way back to my car. I can't even begin to think of what that man was about to do while I was sleeping, but his eyes looking back at me through the dark was a horrifying sight that is yet to leave my head. I of course never went back and have mostly refrained from talking about it, just because I know I won't ever get any answers. I was taking a summer hiking and camping vacation a year ago to a small river near my parents' house. I was visiting them for a few days, then going out alone to camp along the river for a night or two and head back home afterward. I don't live in the most adventurous state, so I always try to get out in nature whenever I'm in my parents' town. After visiting them, I set out on my hike. The trail I took to get to the river was around 4 hours at a steady walking pace, but the best part about it was that nobody else ever used it. The river wasn't huge or anything, and there were plenty of trails that were more scenic and actually labeled. This one was just some thin dirt path that wasn't very defined. When I got to the river, it was basically dark, so I pitched my tent and got a fire going so I could relax before bed. As I sat there for a few minutes, I started hearing footsteps coming toward me. I looked over, and after a minute, a man appeared from the trees. He waved at me and came over to my campsite with a smile. He looked like a normal man in his early 30s, though a bit dirty and unkempt, like he'd been camping out here for a while. After introducing himself as John, he made small talk with me, telling me that he was camping not far from here. I went along with the talking just to not be rude, but the whole thing felt off. Eventually, the man said goodnight and walked away. I watched as he went along the river with his flashlight, but after a minute, the light shut off, and there was nothing else after that. I didn't think that much of the encounter initially, but the man definitely had something off about him. What worried me the most was how he had come up just a few minutes after I got the fire going. He had to have been really close by, like he was following me or something. I chopped it all up to my nerves and told myself it was just dumb luck that he was out here. After all, he came up and introduced himself, which I assumed he wouldn't have done if he had any bad intentions. I smothered the fire and stayed up in my tent for a while, then fell asleep. I woke up at sunrise and spent the day hiking along the river. Strangely, I never saw any other campsites though. No signs of fire or tents being set up. Not even in the direction I'd seen the man walk in. I figured he must have been further into the forest, but it only made me slightly more nervous. I got back to my tent just before dark and was surprised to see John sitting next to my unlit campfire. "Can I help you?" I said. He smiled and said he was waiting for me to come back because he had found something down the river. He got up and started walking, urging me to come with him and see for myself. I hesitated. "I'm gonna stay here, John. I'm just a bit tired." He turned around and looked at me with that same smile and asked me again to go with him. We looked each other in the eyes for a long couple seconds, and I knew for sure that something wasn't right. His smile began to fade, and he asked me one more time in a less friendly tone. I chose to not say anything, and after a moment, he turned around and started walking toward the river. As I watched him, I saw the outline of a small gun poking out of his shirt like he had shoved it in the back of his pants. While not uncommon to bring a firearm out in the forests, I'd never known any hiker or camper to have it uncomfortably in the back of their pants belt with their shirt on top of it. The only reason would be to have it concealed from other people's view, which as far as I know, shouldn't be the main concern when going deep into a forest. After seeing that, I started getting everything together and was walking back within the hour. Thankfully, I was able to stay on the path in the dark and made it back to my car after 4.5 hours of walking. The more I think about it now, the more terrifying that encounter was. I'm almost sure he had followed me to my campsite, but I don't know for how long or if he was stalking me the entire time I was there. Him trying to lure me out to the river was almost surely an attempt at something awful, and I think that if I hadn't left when I did, he probably would have come back later in the night, and I never would have been seen again. Me and one of my good friends, I'll call him Jesse, would go on camping trips once or twice a year. We used to more when we were roommates in college, but we both worked full-time now. Jesse was the one who actually got me into camping, having done it his whole life. I hadn't even been camping once before I met him. This happened 2 years ago, on one of our yearly camping trips that we went on in the summer. To specify, we didn't go far out or anything. We basically went down a trail, maybe 2 hours out, then set up our tents and everything. The whole point of it was to camp, not to hike, and usually for around 4 to 5 days. When we got to a good spot, Jesse and I put everything together and relaxed. The next 3 days were just as you'd expect. We sat at the campfire and had some drinks and just talked. We went for some walks and played some board games as well, but to sum it all up, we really just relaxed. I mean, that was the whole point of it anyway. On the fourth day, we agreed to wrap it up and head back the next morning. As the sun was starting to set, we prepared to get the campfire going again. Jesse said he'd go for a short walk and collect some dry sticks, and he asked me to get the food out and prep it for cooking. I did as he said, but as the sun faded out, Jesse still wasn't back. It had been maybe 30 minutes, which wasn't a long time for a walk, but it was a long time to be collecting sticks. I figured he must have meant he was going for a walk just to walk, and not necessarily for the sticks. I waited another 30 minutes. The sun was now fully set, and it was getting really dark. I had turned on our heavy lamp for a light source, but I knew it would run out of batteries if I left it on too long. I was getting really worried about Jesse. He was the one who was experienced in everything, so it just didn't make sense for him to get lost like this. I figured it best to at least start the fire so that if he was lost, maybe he'd see the flame and find his way back. I took the lamp and collected a bundle of sticks and started the fire with some matches. By the 2-hour mark, I was really losing it. I didn't know what to do. I was trying to decide between looking for him or going back and calling for help, or just staying put. Every scenario was running through my head. What if he'd gotten hurt and wasn't far away? Then looking for him would make sense. But if he was far away, then me getting lost would only burden everything more. 2 hours and 30 minutes after I'd last seen Jesse, and 2 hours after nightfall, I heard a gunshot. It was far off, somewhat in the direction Jesse went in. But what really scared me about it was that neither of us had brought a gun. I stood up and paced around the campsite for a minute before grabbing the lamp and going out to try and find him. It didn't take long before I heard steady footsteps running toward me. My hand was trembling, holding up the lamp, but the light only reached a few feet ahead. I saw a figure getting closer, and I barely recognized them to be Jesse. His eyes were wide open, and he looked horrified. I'd never seen anyone's expression be that visibly scared before. He told me in a sharp, hushed voice that we needed to leave right now. We ran back to the camp and got our backpacks, but left the rest behind. I questioned him, but he refused to answer until we made it out of the woods. He said someone else was there and approached him on his walk. They held him at gunpoint, making him be quiet and follow them somewhere. Before they reached wherever it was they were taking him, Jesse tried for his escape, and that's when I found him running. That's all he told me, and ever has told me every time I ask. I can tell he's purposefully leaving out some important details, but he still refuses to share them. One he specifically leaves out is the gunshot. He never mentioned it. Personally, I know Jesse is a capable guy, and it wouldn't be far off to assume he tried to overpower the man holding him up. Maybe he got the gun away from him and did what he had to do to escape. It would explain Jesse's traumatized state and why the man didn't chase him. I don't know what happened back there, but ever since, Jesse hasn't wanted to go camping again. Honestly, neither do I, but I just wish I could know the truth about what went down that night. I owned an RV that I would use all the time as a camper in the woods behind my house. It was a piece of junk, but I would only drive it out a couple miles, then park it and hang out for a few days, so it didn't need to be anything special. Around 4 years ago, I took this RV out into the woods for a normal weekend of camping. I drove out on the dirt road about a mile, then pulled off into a small plot in between all the trees and set up camp. I made a small fire and brought out chairs, then sat back and had some drinks. I'd take friends out with me a lot, but they weren't always able to spend several days away, though this was just some time I was spending with myself. As night started coming in, I put some more fuel in the fire pit. Just after the sun had fully gone down, I heard something moving around outside my camp. It didn't sound like any wildlife. It sounded more like a person walking somewhere out in the trees. I looked out in that direction, but didn't see anything. This went on for around 20 minutes, hearing what sounded like someone walking around my camp. I put out the fire and went inside the RV, locking it up for the night and checking out the windows over the next hour, but still never seeing anything. From all the times I'd come out into the woods, I'd never once had someone come across my camp, so this was not a normal occurrence. Also, knowing that they were wandering in the dark without a flashlight was even less normal. I double-checked the locks before going to bed, and thankfully, I got a good night's sleep. In the morning, I got up and made coffee, ate breakfast, and spent a couple hours in the RV before going outside. I wanted to take a hike around, but I wasn't too comfortable with leaving my RV there, knowing that someone else was out here, so instead I went for a short walk. I went out where I had heard the person from last night, looking for any shoe prints to confirm that it was actually a person, but from my quick search, I didn't find anything helpful. I don't know if it made me more or less uneasy, but when I got back to the RV, I brought out my handgun and strapped it to my waist, just to be safe. When it was night again, I started up the fire pit and tried to take my mind off of things. I sat outside for a while, I want to say probably an hour, and was relieved to have not heard anyone. I had a beer and listened to the calming sound of the woods at night until I got sleepy. I stood up and went to put out the fire when I saw a figure in the corner of my eye. My head quickly shifted to look at them. They were standing between the trees, maybe 25 feet away, glowing in the faint light of the fire pit and just watching me. Only a moment passed before they turned and walked away, leaving the light. I was really creeped out, and not hearing any more footsteps or movement only made me more paranoid about where they could be. I picked up everything I had outside and put it in the RV, then put out the fire and locked myself inside again. I was even thinking about fully packing up and heading home in the morning because this just wasn't going to be a nice time anymore. Whoever was out there had now come by my RV twice, and neither time did they say anything or introduce themselves. I stayed on watch for a couple hours, checking the windows multiple times and listening intently. It was during the third hour, while I was nodding off in my chair, that I heard footsteps approaching the RV. They were walking quickly, going right up to the door. I stayed quiet, clutching my pistol and hoping for them not to do anything. There were a few odd seconds of them not making a sound, but just standing on the other side of the door. Then they slowly walked around the RV, then quickly ran away. I stayed awake until the sun came up, and as soon as it was clear enough to drive, I got the RV ready and drove home. Whoever was out there had to have some sick plans for them to be coming up to my RV like that in the middle of the night, and I knew that if I stayed, it would likely have ended up really bad for one of us, and I wasn't going to take my chances for it to be me. I was on a camping trail in the northern Appalachians, I believe 5 years ago now. It wasn't anything special, just some new trail I was going along. I'd done many trails on this mountain range before, and was confident in camping and hiking them. Based on my research beforehand, I planned to be on trail for 3 days, camping the 2 nights. The first portion was a decently beaten path, but the further out I got, the less apparent the path became. I continued still, until a few things caught my attention, and I started to wonder if I was even on the right path anymore. I checked my map and compass, as well as some directional notes I made on my phone when I was researching. After looking into it, I was 90% sure I was on a different path. However, the map showed no alternative paths on the route, so I was really unsure where I was. I turned around and followed the path back to try and get on the right trail again, but it was starting to get dark and I was worried that I'd venture off and get further lost. So, I set up camp where I was. I didn't go through the effort of doing a full setup. I just put down my tent and that was about it. I bundled up in my sleeping bag and fell fast asleep. A few hours into the night, I woke up. To the best of my knowledge, it was for no other reason than having to use the bathroom. But when I unzipped the tent and went out to the trees, I noticed a glow in the distance. An unmistakable flickering glow of a campfire. My first thought was maybe someone had coincidentally followed the wrong path as well, but as I thought it over, I realized the chances of that were extremely low. It was also around 2 a.m., though having a fire going in the middle of the night like this was very unusual. I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep knowing someone was nearby, and I wouldn't feel safe unless I knew they were just fellow campers. My big idea was to start a fire of my own, hopefully showing them that I was nearby if they didn't already know. And if they were planning something, then it would show them that I was awake and aware. I burned up a flame big enough for them to see, but only a minute or two later, they put their fire out. My face went numb. There was no way this was a coincidence too. I waited the night out, checking frequently for any sign of whoever was out there, but there was nothing else. In the morning, I rolled up my tent and got my gear ready, but my curiosity got the best of me. If they were just campers, maybe they know the way back too. I had my handgun holstered to my chest just in case, and I approached the site. It was empty, but there were clear signs of a fire. There were also multiple shoe prints all around, and not far off, a small hut, or maybe a cabin, not something temporary. I approached with caution and looked inside the open door. The place was old and musty smelling, but inside there was tons of camping gear. Tents, hiking sticks, bags, everything a camper or hiker would need. Expensive gear too, not just some cheap junk. The way it was piled up though, it didn't seem like it was from one person, or even from one time frame. Some of this stuff was new, and some of it was older. I turned away and started quickly going back. By some miracle, I happened to stumble by a boulder that I remembered passing on my way up, and from there, I found my way to the right path. I took it back to the way I came and got out ASAP. I notified the police just in case, but nothing came of it. I don't think they ever searched the area, but I think whoever was out there was stealing people's camping equipment by getting them to go off the main path. I don't know how they did it, or if anyone who fell victim was able to make it out, but I think I was extremely close to finding out firsthand